Hello everyone. Today we're joined by Christophe Porot, who is currently a PhD student at philosophy at France, I believe.
Mhm.
So could you first explain what got you interested in philosophy?
Yes, I suppose I always had a philosophical disposition as a child, and there's a theory that we're kind of born philosophers and it's beaten out of us by society. That's what Charles Tolliver likes to say. So in my early youth, I was always asking the big questions about mortality, about right and wrong, about justice, and um, when I was in high school, I discovered a copy of Descartes' Meditations in my brother's room. And I read the book, and I was just astounded by some of the reflections and the possibility of doubting even the external world. And I read it right before hockey camp, so it transformed the way I experienced hockey camp. And I learned at that moment there's a phenomenological content to philosophy, that we don't just read and encounter ideas, we inhabit them. So, it's not that we possess ideas and we manipulate and use them. Ideas also manipulate and use us. We kind of dwell in them like a home. And I wanted to spend the rest of my life dwelling and searching for the right ideas. And the last thing I'll say about it is when I was in college, I initially had other plans, but my mother passed away early in college. And the big questions arose again in light of the absence of my mother. And I found that the department most hospitable to answering those types of questions or conversing about them was definitely the philosophy and, to an extent, the theology department. Yeah.
Okay, I see. That's quite an interesting story. Um, I guess the next question is, what do you enjoy most about academia?
So that's a great question. You know, I think that academia, it has a lot of flaws, undeniably. But also, what I enjoy most about it is the mentorship process. It's like any other craft that you take seriously. There's a process of tutelage and mentorship that begins in the professor-student relation and then continues as you become an early career professional and goes onward from there. So, I work at Cambridge University at the Center for the Study of Platonism, and I'm mentored there by Douglas Headley, who's an incredible philosopher. From my undergraduate days, I'm still mentored by Charles Tolliver, one of the great living philosophers of religion, and a host of other mentors I've encountered along the way at Harvard and elsewhere, who have transformed my life in this kind of tutelage mentorship dynamic in academia, where you're not merely exploring these great ideas, but also learning how to think, learning how to explore them more profoundly through one on one teaching settings and styles and communities and all of that. I think that's really precious. And that's probably my favorite thing about academia.
Yeah, that's great. I think it goes all the way back to like the ancient Greeks, right? And
Hmm.
this idea of like a Socratic dialogue. And I feel like that tradition has been continued throughout the history of philosophy, at least in the West.
It's so essential. You're right. And to the extent that Socrates was a kind of mentor, you could consider him to so many, including Plato. And Plato was a kind of mentor at a certain stage to Aristotle, and Aristotle to Alexander the Great. And there's lineages that are developed through mentorship lines that are very interesting. And
Yes.
I think it's critical. It's important.
Yes. Okay, so now we'll talk about some of your areas of specialization.
Hmm.
So, what are the key philosophical arguments for and against the idea of an afterlife?
Well, I think you know it's actually kind of a vast question because it's a really disputed area, the notion of an afterlife. But we have to start with what it's about. It's about the question of whether we could survive biological death. So to confront the afterlife is to confront the notion of the possibility of our own mortality, which a lot of folks in an inauthentic culture tend to deny. We live in a world where there's a lot of suppression of the darker side. So, I'm reading a book right now called Staring at the Sun, which I happen to have right here. I'm not trying to give
Okay.
publicity to the book. It's Irvin Yalom. He's a psychiatrist and philosopher. And Staring at the Sun is a sequence of meditations on how to confront mortality, right? So I think that's a starting point. Now, as far as our key arguments, critical arguments for and against an afterlife, the main issue is the compatibility of an afterlife with theoretical sciences and things like that. And it's very hard to demonstrate affirmatively that there's for sure an afterlife, but it's also equally hard to demonstrate affirmatively that there's annihilation at death. death is a mystery so profound that we kind of have to maneuver and work with the mystery. So, because you think about it like this. We have seen things transform in nature many times, like wood gets burned through fire, becomes ash, or a tree becomes paper, or whatever. We've seen things transform. We've never seen anything come or go out of existence aside from the arrival of a human being at birth. But even that's a transformation of pre-existing physical qualities and stuff in the egg and so forth. So we don't know whether it's possible for something to come and go out of existence, right? And that's a major theoretical presupposition by those who believe that we have annihilation at death. On the other hand, I've argued in a published paper that it's conceivable that even if you're a monist materialist, which means you believe you're naturalist, you believe the only thing in this world are the material substances, that's the only furniture of the cosmos. Even if that's what you believe, there's still ways an afterlife could exist under the existence of a God exterior to the universe. Because if you had an omnipotent God, it's conceivable that at death, the material body is fissioned into two, right? So you have one body that's there, the biologically dead body, and another body that's transported over to some other sphere. And so just an omnipotent being fissioning the bodies at death, completely conceivable. No less peculiar, in my opinion, than a soul that kind of extends beyond. Now, the one thing I'll say is that for Plato and Aristotle, there was a big dispute about whether or not the soul was eternal, right? And Plato kind of thought it was, and Aristotle disagreed. And I think you don't have to believe in eternality to believe in the afterlife, but it does help, of course.
Yes. Okay. So I guess the main issue is that the afterlife isn't something that can be scientifically falsified or verified in some way. And
Yeah, it's a profoundly deep mystery. I mean, it seems to be beyond the reach of science at the moment. There's also questions of redemption. Like the last thing I'll say is, we live in a world where and Quentin Meillassoux, who's at the Sorbonne, where I'm doing my PhD research, writes about this. He calls them these deaths that haunt us. We live in a world where there are these irredeemably terrible deaths, like people born, they immediately have leukemia, they suffer and they die. Or somebody just goes through a horrible experience and then dies at an early youthful stage, or somebody dies nobly or whatever. But we have these deaths that haunt us, and the question is there a cosmological system that redeems life after death? Because if not, I think we have a lot of reason to despair. So this is another way of approaching the afterlife: is what are the ramifications of there being or not being an afterlife upon our theories of cosmological justice, the redemption of life, the meaning of life, and all of that. And the ramifications are quite significant. But the truth is, I would be content with us living in a society that even began to discuss the fact that from cradle to grave, we avoid the topic of our own mortality a little bit too much. And we're all of a sudden stunned when somebody we know or love dies, and we hide it like a secret. And I think we need to live in a more open culture about the possibility of mortality or the possibility of an afterlife and the ramifications of those two ways of thinking.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I think this idea of the afterlife as some sort of justification also has roots in Christian theodicy when it comes to the problem of evil. And I think the issue with that is it takes a very utilitarian logic, right? It's the suffering at present in your mortal existence can be justified afterwards, retrospectively, with eternal bliss or whatever. So I think
right. I mean,
there's definitely an ethical issue there.
Yeah, and there's also people who say that there's an ethical issue on the concept of there being a heaven and hell. How could those who were supposedly good be so unempathetic to live in a world where they have eternal bliss, aware that there is a world of eternal torment beneath them, and not be bothered by it and still be blissful? Of course, I think one of my mentors, who I mentioned earlier, Taillefer, has the best operational definition of heaven and hell, which is, in both cases, God loves you profoundly. The difference is one of inner conscience, that heaven is the awareness that you feel like you deserve the love you feel from God, the infinite love. and hell is when you feel like you don't deserve that love. And so you're not actually experientially going through or like externally going through anything else. You're being loved eternally and infinitely, but the inner conscience determines whether that love is received as a burden or a gift.
Mm, that's quite interesting. Yeah. Okay, I guess we'll move on to the next question, which is, in contemporary philosophy of religion, which arguments about the existence of God do you find most philosophically fruitful, even if you don't fully accept them yourself, and why?
Good. Yeah, so it's a really good question because I'm going to petition for an argument I'm trying to revive, which is an argument from Malebranche that I think has been one of the most historically fruitful arguments
Okay,
for the existence of God, which I think deserves a place in contemporary philosophy. Even if it's a little bit more ignored, I'm trying to revive it myself to a degree.
sure. Yeah.
Um, but Malebranche, who was this Cartesian thinker and this brilliant genius, he's the one. Do you know Hume's denial of causation?
Oh, yeah, I've come across it. Yeah.
Yeah, like Hume is this famous argument where you could deny the logic of causation because if I drop a ball once and it falls to the floor, why should the second time I expect it's going to fall to the floor again? I
Yeah.
could let go of the ball, it goes up or it goes to the right or the left. So from where do we get this sense that there's this causal efficacy, right?
Hmm.
And this is a kind of skepticism that's made Hume very famous. But a lot of it was borrowed from Malebranche, who was the initial skeptic of causation. And he had these arguments for why you could deny um, causal efficacy in every case except for one, which is logically necessary. So, if you can deny the fact that there's causal efficacy in every logical case, every case you conceive of, just because it's happened in the past doesn't mean it's going to happen again in the future.
Hmm.
We have no evidence of laws of nature that is beyond the presupposition of the laws of nature. Because, a lot of folks didn't like laws of nature because it was very theistic. It implied a lawgiver and such. Um, but what Malebranche said was there is one definition of causation that is logically necessary, and it's the relationship between an omnipotent agent and the upshots of its will. In other words, causation is logically necessary if there's omnipotence. If there's an all powerful being, then there would be causal efficacy because, by definition, that's what it means for being to be all powerful, that it is causally efficacious. But this meant God was the immediate cause of all things, um,
Hmm.
which was very interesting and very fruitful. It kind of brought occasionalism, which was popular. Occasionalism is the theory that God is in every moment sustaining the world through immediate causal efficacy. And it was very popular in Islamic philosophy, and Malebranche kind of brought it into the West. And I think that this skepticism that Malebranche developed along the way to develop his conclusion of the logical necessity of omnipotence was hyper fruitful for the debates and arguments and skepticism around causation, laws of nature, regularities in nature, and all of that stuff, and got us thinking about how peculiar it is that we have causal regularity in the world. And I think that was a great philosophical jumpstart to a profound sequence of questions, which I'd like to revive. I think it's a very interesting conversation. Does that make
How would
sense?
you just, uh, I think so. Yeah. How would you distinguish it from other cause-based arguments like the cosmological argument?
Yeah, well, the cosmological argument, or like the Kalam cosmological argument, these are arguments that are not about the theoretical conditions in which causation at all exists, right?
Hmm.
Which is like a foundational claim about the mere fact that I drop a ball, it falls to the floor, right? Their cosmological arguments have to do with the whole cosmos existing, right? So they're
Yeah.
bigger arguments. They're about creation and these kinds of things, and ontological arguments are about the essence of the being and what you could derive definitionally from the essence of the being to its necessity of existing and stuff. And I think that you know the cosmological argument, while it has some flaws, the various versions of it, but it zooms out a lot, right?
Hmm.
Whereas there's something mystical about the causation argument from Malebranche that I'm discussing, because it makes you realize that there's something magical about the fact that we live in a world where there's causal regularity at all, where I can walk to the store And I know when I put my left foot in front of my right foot and my right foot in front of my left foot, I will be going in a direction because the floor beneath me is not randomly going to turn into birds, right? I can depend on this. And it makes you realize this very fragile condition of existence, that everything is causally ordered for us and everything. And I think it's a very profound insight to address. Does that make sense, the
Mhm.
difference that I have in mind?
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense. So in this sense, could you say it's perhaps more similar to some kind of design argument because it addresses like this idea of regularity in the universe and takes
Hmm.
that as a starting point?
Huh. Would it be a design argument? Good question. So the design argument is like, just to give the audience a sense of it, like Pele's watch, right? The
Yeah,
notion that you're walking on the beach and you stumble upon a watch that's perfectly operational and functional, and you wouldn't say, "Oh, well, that watch was randomly generated by a sequence of random events." You would say there was a watchmaker. So you look at this world and how it's functional, and you say there's a world maker behind it, right?
yeah.
So I think the causation argument is a little bit more metaphysically precise than the design argument, which again zooms out to the whole rational ordering of the cosmos itself
Yeah.
in the design argument. And this is just the mere concept of causation, which is admittedly a fairly dense philosophical concept, but the mere concept of cause and effect is highly problematic philosophically. Hume made it very famously problematic, but Hume was inspired to a large degree by Malebranche to make it famously problematic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. Because I remember there were like recent developments to the design argument. I think Swinburne talked about design qua regularity and this idea of a temporal order to the universe on a broader level,
Mm-hmm.
and that the idea of like natural laws that are adhered to throughout the cosmos across different periods of time is another like higher evidence of design beyond just like Paley's watch analogy. So
Of course, yeah. I mean, Swinburne uses a lot of statistical analysis too in his process. So he looks at the probability of these things being occurring and then being fixed and stable, and argues that the probability is so low and the outcome of life is so rewarding that it implies some kind of intent or design. And Swinburne's very interesting to follow through. Um, I personally, just to give you full disclosure here on the theoretical conditions of God and everything, um, I think that you could establish the rationality of believing in God through something like Swinburne's arguments, uh,
yeah.
or through something like an interesting Kalam cosmological argument, or looking at Malebranche and causation. You establish the inherently logical attitude affiliated with looking at God as a serious possibility. But I think belief, and again, not everybody believes this along with me, but I think belief is something that is structured beyond argumentation,
Mm,
and is part of the
yeah.
inner life that we kind of uh, we feel the divine light, we see things as having meaning and things of this nature, and we conclude that there is ultimately something greater than us. Evelyn Underhill, one of the great scholars of mysticism, likes to say that, or would say in one of her works, that we stand at the intersection of realities, right? We have this finitude that we experience, but we also have a taste of the infinite, and we are kind of in at the intersection of those two possibilities. And the spiritual life is very much reconciling those possibilities. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
makes
I like
sense.
Swinburne. I think he's very, very clever, but I think what he establishes is merely that it's quite rational to believe in God. He doesn't convince me that God exists. I think you need alternative inner conscious experiences to believe in the divine and so forth.
Okay. Yeah. I guess you sort of just answered this, but how do you see the relationship between faith and reason in theology today?
Very high, maybe too high.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'll just say really quickly, Leibniz, who was this great mathematician and philosopher and theologian, kind of established the principle of sufficient reason, right? Which is the notion that there's a reason why things are one way and not another.
Hmm.
And this is a metaphysical principle that's quite popular. Quintin Meillassoux here in Paris argues against it. I kind of negotiate with it in my own work. But the principle of sufficient reason attributes reason to everything. So it's almost nothing is random. What I find interesting about this is my own theoretical development, is that the PSR, principle of sufficient reason, is actually very similar to the condition of hyperreason in madness, which is to say that according to Lacan and G.K. Chesterton and Woody Kroosters and a few other great thinkers, madness is not merely the absence of reason, it's the absence of everything but reason. So to the mad mind, the psychotic mind or whatever, when you step out into the street and you see a red car go by, it can't be random that the car is red. There has to be a reason the car was red and not otherwise. And the window that's ajar on the third story of a building cannot randomly be ajar on the third story of a building. There has to be a reason why. And I think that when we over attribute reason, we lose actually a sense of reality. There's a contingency in reality. There's a certain randomness that we have to get ourselves comfortable with. And it's the principle of sufficient reason implies as well that typically the reason why it's one way and not another is for our own well-being, because Leibniz was trying to create the optimal world argument, right? So it's one way and not another, and it's one way and not another for the betterment of our own well-being. And so I think the relationship between theology and reason can be quite intensely high, and I think God is much more rational, reasonable position. I think atheism has to wrestle more with contingency and randomness than theology does, which can take that out of the picture. And I negotiate between the two as well as I can.
Okay, that's great. You mentioned Quentin Meillassoux. I think I might have come across his ideas in the past. Is he like a speculative realist who argues that everything is contingent in some way?
He's kind of the speculative realist, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I
So,
know him. I've had several conversations with him,
oh,
and I'm
okay.
incorporating his work into my thesis and everything. He's bright like the sun. I mean, he's a sharp mind.
Hmm. So if we accept his speculative realism, then that would reject like this whole idea of causation, right? Because everything would be random.
Well, it's very interesting because ontologically, yes, ontologically, there's a hyper chaos that would be the underlying reality beneath the world we experience. But at another level, things are fixed and stable, and that's a matter of empirical reality. That hyper chaos is not incompatible with there being a fixed, stable system. And the way I think about it is kind of, he probably wouldn't like this reductio ad absurdum simplicity I'm using, but
Okay.
um, I think about it just like in statistics, right? In when they talk about the hot hand in basketball, statistically, it's quite possible that in a random sequence, you'll have, if the random sequence is long enough, a phase of the same thing reoccurring over and over again, right? There's nothing about the randomness of the sequence being incompatible with recurrence, right? So I think that the hyperchaos
Yeah.
is in a sense causally responsible for whatever occurs, right? Randomness or absolute contingency is the underlying reality. But that's compatible with the fact that we live in a stable, fixed world, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
We don't have any guarantees the world will stay stable and fixed distant into the
Yes.
future. But we also don't have any guarantees that there won't be, for instance, in Quentin Meillassoux just to bring it back to philosophy of religion, he wrote an article called Le Dieu à venir. And he talked about the possibility that a God emerges in the future, a God that he doesn't believe God could exist now because of the problem of evil and such. But perhaps in the future, a God could emerge, right? And that would be a transformative instant that would reshape because hyper chaos is not incompatible with anything, essentially. That's what's so interesting about it.
Mm. Yeah, that is quite interesting. I think I'll look more into that. So you just mentioned the problem of evil. So the problem of evil obviously remains central to the philosophy of religion today. Um, are there any recent works or perspectives that you think significantly shift the conversation?
Well, I think there's two things to say. One is logically, it's not necessarily, it's more of an emotive problem than a logical problem, in the sense that the propositional content, which enables the problem of evil to be understood as a problem, is not logically necessary because there's these intermediary steps. Like you'd have to add into the equation that God could have, on an infinite and eternal scale, no redemptive reason to
Yeah.
permit suffering, right?
Hmm.
And that's very hard to prove. So it's more of an emotional thing that we just see this horrible suffering, and a reasonable emotional thing, but we see this horrible suffering and we say, there can't be a God. There can't be a God who loves us and is all powerful, because why would he let this happen? Now,
Yeah.
I am somewhat opposed to a degree to the notion that we just have to be intellectually humble about it, and that there are things we cannot understand and therefore there's a justification for evil, but we cannot know it. I find that strategy to be honest but not persuasive. Um, I find the free will argument to be minimally persuasive. I don't think, the idea that we're enabled by free will to do as we wish. It accounts for maybe interpersonal evils between humans, supposing free will, but it doesn't account for the existence of naturally occurring evils, like a volcano erupts and incinerates a village, right?
Yeah.
And so, there's these naturally occurring evils, that there's evils beyond free will. Um, but I would think I'm working on the problem of evil a little bit, and I shouldn't be sharing all these arguments that are unpublished, but I'm sharing them anyway.
Okay.
It's considered bad practice because somebody else can steal them, but I don't care. Well, to anybody who's thinking of stealing them, cite me. But the one thing I'll say is I actually think there's another justification, which is omniscience, the divine predicate of omniscience, all knowingness in God,
Hmm.
would require God to have, and Linda Zabzebski writes about this, omnisubjectivity, an awareness of what every conceivable human experience is like, right?
Right.
So, in a way, if you have a perspective that, in a way, the divine is within us, God is co experiencing the world with us, there would necessarily have to be every conceivable human experience and other type of being experience would have to be instantiated so that God could be omniscient, from the understanding of subjective knowledge, from the understanding that there is a type of knowledge of, Thomas Nagel's what it's like to be a bat, right? There's a type of knowledge of what it's like to see through echolocation. Well, if you read the Genesis the way Maimonides read Genesis, Maimonides, this great Jewish philosopher,
Okay.
Maimonides looked at Genesis and said, this theory that the original sin was disobedience to God is so irritating because it ignores what kind of fruit Adam and Eve ate, right? They ate the
Yeah.
fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. So the original sin was not merely disobedience, but also intellectual laziness, thinking that we could have this kind of cosmological knowledge of the difference between good and evil easily. And the fall, therefore, would be the process by which we acquire that knowledge. I think there could be some kind of a knowledge omniscience based argument of why God experiences evil in order to understand fully the possibilities of existence, and that we are co-experiencing it with God, or maybe that we are, in fact, from a more mystical perspective, what we really are is God, and we're blind to it. In the Advaita tradition in Hinduism, this is a kind of perspective that might be popular. And so, we're blind to the fact that we are God, and we're experiencing these things ourselves. The moment we wake up and we realize we are God and we are eternal and we are infinite, the pain seems to diminish greatly. And a lot of mystics write about that. Mystics like Hafez and Rumi would write about, this beautiful life and this beautiful, 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 beautiful. Even the pain is beautiful, and it's a divine perspective. And so, I think that ignorance is one of the things that makes suffering worse, is not knowing why we're suffering. And if you give yourself a reason to explain the suffering, like Nietzsche's, he who has a why can endure any how, then the suffering decreases and you can endure it. And so I think that the intervention needed from a theological, philosophical perspective to make the problem of evil go away has to not be that God has infinite eternal time to fix it and so forth, but it has to be that there's something constitutive about the suffering that relates to a reason that we can know. And the reason I give is omniscience, to understand fully the depth of the human experience, the depth of the experience of being, There must be both suffering and happiness and joy. And that knowledge of the depth, which I think of the human experience is very important. The last thing I'll say about the problem of evil is I think its capacity to be justified is somewhat dependent on which religious tradition you're looking through, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
again, something I proposed this to BYU actually, but if you look at the Latter-day Saints tradition, also known as Mormons, although they don't like to go by Mormons now, they have a theory of exaltation that when they die, the really good LDS members become God themselves in another universe. They
Okay.
become gods of a universe or a cosmos. And that theory would make the soul making argument of C.S. Lewis that somehow suffering makes us better at loving and this kind of stuff, which it might. It would make that argument more persuasive because now the shattering of the private self through suffering could be understood as an essential ingredient in God making, because now an entire universe depends on my personal growth. So if I have to suffer a little bit to grow into wisdom, so be it. It seems like a worthy exchange, you know. So that's an interesting. I think what religion we're looking at will determine what degree the problem of evil remains a significant problem as well.
Okay. That's really interesting. Um, so what is an argument for this idea of omnisubjectivity?
Well, the argument for omnisubjectivity is just that it's not. It's just that if you believe God is omniscient, right,
Hmm.
which means that God is all knowing.
Yeah.
If God only has propositional knowledge, knowledge of propositional content, God is missing subjective knowledge and is therefore not omniscient, right?
Okay. Yeah.
But then the follow up to that would be, can God have the subjective knowledge without the experience?
Yeah.
Can God not experience what it's like to be a bat and know what it's like to be a bat? And there's where the terrain of debate might occur, because for me, I would say you need the experiential content in order to understand experiential content or experiential knowledge.
Hmm.
And you find this in philosophy and analytic philosophy and stuff. You find like standpoint epistemology, right? Which, especially for people who are oppressed, will say there's a certain standpoint of or vantage point that I experience because I'm oppressed, and not me personally, but the theory goes because I suffer oppression. There's certain things I know about oppression, especially what it's like to be oppressed, that can't be known without having been oppressed. Right? This kind of experiential
Yeah.
knowledge, this kind of standpoint epistemology, all gets wrapped up into God must experience these things. But if God must experience these things, God must also experience them both on the awareness that it is God, right? And in the ignorance that it is God. And hence we have the human experience. We are gods, ignorant of the fact that we are God, right?
Hmm.
So because that's a precondition. So it's just God experiencing everything, but in some cases aware that it's God experiencing the thing, and in other cases ignorant about the fact that it's God experiencing the thing. And the ignorance becomes an essential ingredient into the divine subjective knowledge, which takes away the problem of divine hiddenness, which is a famous critique of the possibility of God existing. That if their point of life is to be redeemed with God, why are there certain populations that have no access to knowledge about God and such? So this
Yeah.
divine hiddenness seems to be kind of like a version of evil that we're. But now, if God is always there but has to be ignorant in moments, divine hiddenness is not as great a problem. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about the relation between omniscience and the problem of evil.
Right. Okay. Um, but how would this solve the problem of evil, though? Because by accepting that we are all constituents of God in some way, that still doesn't change the fact that there are like horrible acts of suffering that people have to endure. So, what would be your response to that idea?
Yeah. So I mean, the idea is when if the self is an illusion,
Hmm.
right? If the ego is essentially illusory,
Yeah.
these horrible acts of suffering are more like a drama. This is kind of a Teilhard de Chardin point. But if you look at a movie or a great piece of literature, it usually starts in darkness before ending in light. It usually, there has to be suspense, right?
Hmm.
And so this journey of God through time is one of a drama unfolding where there's going to be suspense, there's going to be the appearance of evil, there's going to be the appearance of horribleness, but at the end, it's all God underneath it all, experiencing every possible experience to be omniscient. So the end goal is quite glorious, and the journey, which again, does nothing to reduce. I mean, this is famously the hardest problem in philosophy of religion, right? So I don't mean to say anything to reduce the dignity and worthiness and high value and everything else of those who suffer profoundly. I myself have suffered profoundly in my life, and many people have suffered far worse than me. But suffering is a reality. But the question is, does it increase knowledge or not? And if it does,
Mhm.
then God can't be omniscient without suffering. In other words, were there to be no suffering, there would be no God. Now, if the self is an illusion, then the person undergoing the great, terrible experience is undergoing an illusion of a great, terrible experience. And if they knew they were God, they would be laughing the whole time because they would transcend the experience, right? That's the kind of idea that I would put in place. Again, it's very hard because you look at uh, people are hung, people are abused sexually or physically or psychologically. People go through so much, but a lot of mystics, a lot of the great mystical thinkers suffered a lot in their life before they realized the kind of unity between them and God. And once they realize that unity, the suffering tends to disappear. So there is an escape route. And of course, death, if it's conceived of as the erasure of the illusory self, you're instantly aware that you're God the moment you die. So, every conceivable type of suffering has to be instantiated, but also every conceivable type of joy has to be instantiated for God to be fully omniscient. And otherwise, I don't think there's a concept of a God that can be viable. So it's either you do or don't believe in God. But to believe that suffering is a difficulty for God's existence, I flip it and say the absence of suffering would make it harder for me to believe in God.
Okay. So in some ways, suffering becomes necessary for God to exist. But then I guess like my only remaining question is like, what's the purpose of this universe? Like, why would God create a universe with joy and suffering? And like, what would be the motive behind this?
Yeah. So, look, I think so. What is God's motive to create? Right.
Yeah.
That's a really profound question. It's more theological to me than philosophical because it's
Okay.
really trying to attribute something to the will and reason of God as to why God created a universe at all. My theoretical condition would be um, there's two ways of looking at it. There's kinetic creation, which is kenosis. This was like Simone Weil and Teilhard de Chardin. The notion that God did not create a universe, especially not ex nihilo. God simply was everything and diminished itself to make space for other types of beings to exist, right?
Okay.
So in this notion, it's the very absence of God that allows for all this evil to occur because God diminished itself, and we're on a path to bring God back, right? The other way of looking at it would be, and again, I'm not trying to be too evasive, but I think love. It depends whether you think love is foundationally a good thing or a bad thing, I guess.
Hmm.
But if you think love is a redemptively good thing, which I do, there has to be otherness for love. There has to be the experience, even if there's an ontological, metaphysical sameness. You have to at least have the appearance of otherness, of two different beings that love each other, right?
Yeah.
And so, why? So, for God to create a world in which love was possible, it would have to be a world in which there were beings other than God. God, being the perfect being, would be a being that doesn't cause harm and suffering, but other types of beings, the max plurality of other types of beings, would likely create harm and suffering because uh, they, by definition, are not perfect, and the imperfections generate the harm and the suffering and such. So, love is almost conditional on the otherness from God. And if you think love is foundationally good, then the motive for God could have been to experience love through the concept of otherness, instantiated in ignorance of the fact that God is everything, and he has to dupe himself into believing that he's not everything in order to experience
Okay.
love. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think both of those
It
are quite convincing, I'd say.
Yeah, it's the hardest question, so I can't in shorthand form give a very convincing
Yeah,
answer, but I can do my best to allude to things, right?
yes, yes. Okay. So I've also noticed that you've done a lot of research into Platonism. So my next question is, what are some of the lasting ideas from Platonism that are still relevant today?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, so many. It's I'm almost picking arbitrarily. I'm just going to pick one that I think is of great
Okay,
importance.
sure.
But the notion of innate ideas is really important, right?
Mm,
So the Cambridge Platonists, who were Neoplatonic thinkers in England in the 18th, 17th century, they uh, they were very into this notion of innate ideas, right?
mhm,
Noam Chomsky, who is known for universal grammar and his role in cognitive science and linguistics, was very inspired by innate ideas in the Neoplatonists. And there's a movement today in cognitive science, which my brother, who's a professor of cognitive science and philosophy, is a promoter of, known as cognitive nativism. The idea that the great ideas are not something we discover external to us, they're within us from the beginning.
okay.
Um, and I think that's probably in the world of cognitive science an incredible prediction by Plato that, if we really look at what how our thinking operates, we'll find we have innate ideas rather than just ideas that come from the outside.
Mm. So would you say this would like conclusively end the rationalism vs empiricism debate? Because I think that's centered around the idea of whether we had innate ideas or not, where the rationalists supported it, but then the empiricists totally rejected it. So with contemporary cognitive science advancements, would traditional empiricist ideas that we have known innate ideas be completely outruled?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that they should be outruled in from a philosophical level even before, because the way we look at there's a reason why cognitive science has such a relationship to philosophy of mind, and why psychology was born out of philosophy through William James and others. It's
Yes.
because of the fact that the way we approach the sciences is pre-designed by the philosophical presuppositions we incorporate into the process, right? So,
Mhm.
but if you look at like John Locke's famous blank slate tabula rasa argument, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and Aristotle actually uses that metaphor too, but for the passive intellect versus the active intellect, totally different subject. But
Mhm.
um, but the notion of a blank piece of paper that can be written upon is itself something that already possesses innate potentiality. The paper is not a random thing; it has to have the capacity to be written upon, right?
Mhm.
So even the empirical perspective that everything is written into us requires an innateness of that capacity to have things written upon us. So
Right.
I think from a philosophical perspective, the debate should be shut down and we should go in the cognitive nativist direction. I'll let the cognitive scientists work out the details.
Right. Okay. I do think that's quite interesting, like your perspective on the blank slate. Um, yeah. Okay, so next question. How do you view the difference between analytic and continental philosophy? And do you think there is ever a hope of reconciling these two traditions?
Yeah, so I think the main difference between analytic and continental philosophy is a question of scope, right? Because they've
Mhm.
tried these arguments about methodology, but some continental philosophers are very analytic in their methodology, almost too much. And some analytic philosophers go a little continental in moments. And, there's these two cultural camps. But I think the narrowness versus wideness argument is probably the most persuasive, that the scope is very different. Continental philosophers will look at something as big as existence, whereas analytic philosophers are kind of modeling themselves after the sciences and trying to answer more narrow questions, right?
Mm.
So, given that the scope is the main difference, it creates an inherent compatibility between the two. One that I aspire um, to express in my own work, because I was at Harvard, which has a very analytic philosophy department. I'm at the Sorbonne, which is more historical and somewhat continental. Um,
Mhm.
the Platonist, the Center for the Study of Platonism at Cambridge is very interesting. That's kind of ancient Greek philosophy and its ramifications throughout time. And there's all these different ways of doing philosophy, and I think we shouldn't limit ourselves to a singular method. Now, the one thing I'd like to tell people is like there is a cost, of course, when you're trying to reconcile analytic and continental philosophy. You know what the cost is?
Oh no.
A social life. You have no time because you're spending too much time reading too much literature, looking at too many different things to try to to try to competently discuss the intersection and compatibility of these sorts of things. Some great philosophers really do it successfully, and again, Charles Tolliver is probably the premier case of both analytic and continental informed philosophy being expressed. Um,
Mm, okay. So how would you handle the criticism that analytic philosophy is sort of a kind of anti-philosophy because it just deems a lot of the classic philosophical questions to be like empty questions and that they aren't really worth investigating?
yeah, so that was especially true in the early phase of analytic philosophy, right? They would say like, well, if the reference cannot be clearly established, there's no point in asking the question. So
Yeah.
value questions have no point and stuff like that. I think analytic philosophy itself kind of rescued itself from that problem. I think Hilary Putnam in particular, who was influenced by the pragmatists, which is a whole nother camp, pragmatism, right? Analytic
Mm,
philosophy, continental philosophy, pragmatism, where does that fit? And the pragmatists are so amazing. But he was influenced by the pragmatists in acknowledging the collapse of the fact value dichotomy. He was also influenced by Iris Murdoch, which is to say that, we say, oh, there's facts and there's values, right? That was kind of essential to denying the legitimacy of value oriented conversations. But what is a fact? A fact is determined by a collection of epistemic values, right? Like coherence, simplicity, falsifiability, without which you would have no facts. So a fact is a collection of values um, over a singular phenomena. It is not a valueless experience to understand something as a fact. It reflects epistemic values. So we have to get rid of this notion of the fact value dichotomy. And that was somewhat generated by somewhat analytic philosopher in Hilary Putnam. And I think that opened the door. Now, culturally, I do think analytic philosophy, that criticism is fair. Analytic philosophy ignores a lot of really important questions sometimes. Not universally, but a lot of analytic philosophers culturally do ignore the
yeah.
really important questions. And I think that we have to accept that criticism fully and and negotiate with the fact that, look, I think Dan Dennett had a great definition of philosophy. He said philosophy is what you do when you don't know what to do, right? It operates in the gray zone. So before there was science, there was natural philosophy. We didn't know what to do with nature, so we were philosophizing. Once we come up with a compatible, coherent, replicable system, it becomes another field like psychology, the natural sciences, cognitive science. So philosophy is the mother of most fields. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so we have to deal with those questions that we don't know exactly what to do with them. And ironically, this is why I find that gray zone most delightful in philosophy of religion, because the essentially religious questions remain quite difficult to parse out. I mean, is there an afterlife? Is there a God? Can there be a justification of evil and so forth? And the last thing I'll say about that is just I think another error that analytic philosophers make is they talk about things that people outside of analytic philosophy truly don't care about. The old Ivy League, ivory tower argument against philosophers or intellectuals generally. We have to take seriously the fact that we live in a world where, according to quite a few polls, the world is dominantly religious, dominantly
Yeah.
spiritual. And in analytic philosophy, it's essentially a shameful thing to answer or address religious questions, unless you're doing analytic philosophy of religion, of course. But even that's got a kind of outcast position. It shouldn't. It should be central to the activity because it's one of the great philosophical issues that the vast majority of the world still cares about.
Yes. So in some ways, philosophy should be more responsive to the community that it works for.
Well, I think that it's very important. I'm not trying to make a fallacious argument appealing to mass interest, right?
Yeah.
But I'm trying to highlight the fact that if let's say atheism is true, let's say that theism is false, atheism is true, atheism being the belief that there is no God, right?
Hmm.
it would be very important to explain to the masses why atheism is true. So to
Yes.
deny the arguments entirely, to deny the question entirely, is shutting down something that's on people's minds. And I do think that asking whether or not you're relevant to the society at large in a meaningful, whether spiritually meaningful or morally meaningful way, is a major thing to ask. Not because it generates accuracy in terms of answers. Mass opinion does not generate the accurate answer, but it generates accuracy in terms of interest to society. And unfortunately, I think a lot of society today has fallen into dogmatic slumbers. People have their presuppositions about they have their ideologies. They're possessed by a singular idea. They don't want it doubted or challenged, and they move forward. And philosophers have allowed the dogmatic slumbers of the world to amplify and continue because they have chosen to only ask questions that are interesting to a small minority group of philosophers and not broadly to the world at large.
Yeah. Okay. So linking to this idea of bringing philosophy to the world at large, what is the importance of public philosophy today, and how do you engage with this?
It's so important. Well, I personally have engaged with public philosophy. I have about 8 publications of the
Wow.
variety of pop culture and philosophy with press. This is something that you see with Blackwell Press, Oxford University Press, Caris Books, and previously Open Court. There are publications that take pop phenomena. So I have a book chapter on Iron Man versus Captain America in philosophy, a book chapter on Mr. Robot in philosophy, these kinds of phenomena, right? So things people are already interested in, and then revealing the philosophy underneath it. So that's one way
Hmm.
to do it. Because philosophy operates a lot through the imagination, right? And so does pop phenomena like music and arts and movies and so forth. And so I think that's a very natural way of engaging public philosophy. The other I think that is very important is what Socrates did essentially, which is engage people directly, talk to people one on one, talk in community forums and stuff. I believe philosophers are supposed to be leaders. In that sense, I agree with Plato to agree. I don't know if I believe in a full blown out philosopher king, but I do think
Yeah.
philosophers are supposed to be leaders. We're supposed to engage humanity at large, and it's a very dangerous thing to do. It ultimately cost Socrates his life, and it's very dangerous because people are very sensitive about the ideas they hold most dear. So you can't be as aggressive as Socrates was, but if you can do it in a somewhat diplomatic way, you can open people's minds and liberate them from internal intellectual prisons, the dogmatic slumbers that are blinding them to reality as such. Yeah. And so
Yes.
that's my quick answer is just pop stuff and philosophy mixed together. I think the value of writing is going down because of AI. And so open conversation, interpersonal dialogues, that value will go up.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's quite cool. I remember Socrates himself hated writing and thought
Hmm.
like open discourse and like actually talking physically was the best way of engaging with philosophy. And so I think maybe there's going to be a return to that.
I hope so. Let's bring the oral tradition back.
Yes.
It's a great tradition.
Hmm. Okay, I guess that brings us to the end of the interview today. So thank you so much for your time and for your ideas.
Thank you very much. I thought you did a great job, and I really enjoyed conversing with you. And
Thank you.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk about philosophical issues that don't get enough attention, in my opinion.